Good morning and welcome to Pilgrim United Church. As you can see, I'm taking the next step towards our future being back in this church building. And I hope that we can do that, soon. And so for today, we'll videotape and you'll be able to enjoy the service as you have for the previous weeks. Our call to worship. After the flood, God's tears mingled with ours, and God choked. Never again. God promised never again. And from light and the mist of those mingled tears, God made a rainbow. A bow in the sky to draw us out beyond our sorrow and remember the promise of all we do, not notice. The holy ephemerals of our common humanity and the God-given colors of love. Amen.
Guide me, O the great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land. I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy powerful hand. Bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. Feed me till I want no more. Open now the crystal fountain, whence the healing stream doth flow. Let a fire and cloudy pillar lead me all my journey through. Strong deliverer, be thou still my strength and shield. Be thou still my strength and shield. When I tread the verge of Jordan, bid my anxious fears aside. Death of death and hell's destruction, let me safe on Canaan's side. Songs of praises, I will ever give to thee. I will ever give to thee.
This morning, this being Lent 1, we are starting our journey of reflection and thoughts of that time when Jesus spent 40 days reflecting himself. And so some people look at taking this time to give something up so that they can cleanse themselves in some way, to open their minds, to be more reflective of what's happening in their lives in this world. And others take time to take something on for Lent. And so as you consider these things this Sunday, we're looking at Genesis 9, verses 8 to 17. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth and on every bird of the air, on every thing that creeps on the ground and on all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your own lifeblood I will surely require a reckoning. From every animal I will require it, and from human beings, each one for the blood of another. I will require a reckoning for human life. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image God made humankind. And you, be fruitful and multiply, abound on the earth and multiply in it." Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off from the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you, for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh." Phew. Well, that was brought home very well from that chapter 9, and all of you will remember the story of Noah, and this particular story is brought to life in this passage. I'd like to say that the Old Testament readings for, in fact, the first 3 Sundays in Lent, this being the first Sunday, gives us a glimpse of 3 covenants: God's covenant with Noah, God's covenant with Abraham, and then on the 3rd of Lent, God's covenant with Israel at Sinai. While each covenant is distinct from the others, taken together, they testify to God's ongoing desire to be in relationship with humanity. Today we are looking at the message found from Genesis about the covenant of God with Noah. And over the next 2 Sundays of Lent, we will review God's covenant with Abraham and Israel at Sinai. The first thing to notice about God's covenant with Noah is that it is not, in fact, with Noah alone. I'm sure you picked up on that repetition. Not with Noah alone, nor with only his family, but rather with every living creature. God commits God's self not just to humanity, but to all of creation. And within this, we see these three elements of that covenant with Noah for our consideration. First, God as a God who is moved. During the season of Lent, the flood story reminds us that God has an incarnational side in the Old Testament. In the flood story, from chapter 6:6, God regrets. Then God grieves. Then God remembers in 8:1. And God sets God's bow in the clouds so that God will remember, from chapter 9, verse 15. That is, God has always desired relationship with and has been moved by the suffering of humanity. So let me point out these things that come through in these chapters in Genesis. God regrets, God grieves, God remembers, and then God sets a bow in the clouds so that God will remember. The second feature is that covenant in our daily lives. In its most general meanings, covenant is simply a sacred agreement, particularly in church contexts. The word covenant can be used for almost any kind of relationship with our church organizing itself, with our created and evolved norms, and with our commitment to follow unconditionally. When do we make promises that we say are unconditional, and yet we end up expecting that we should receive equal payment for keeping up our end of the bargain? And the third feature is that care for creation. Now, we hear a lot about that in these days, and so we should. The ecological implications of the flood story are significant. We receive God's promise that God will never again destroy the earth by flood. Yet human sin and indifference seems bent on the ruin of creation. Genesis 9 reminds us that God is in relationship not just with humanity, but with all flesh. Our living on the earth is bound up with the flourishing of all creation, and especially non-human animals. There are also two important features in this week's Old Testament lection which will have a profound consequence for biblical faith. The first is God's promise never again to destroy life on the planet via a worldwide deluge. I question why some faith communities suggest that these natural disasters are actually God-driven, when in fact we learn in this passage the promise that God made, that God would never again destroy the planet. Like a battering husband who shows up with flowers and a box of chocolates, Yahweh shows up with a rainbow, promising no more, as if even God is taken aback at the depth and breadth of the violence God has wrought on his own creation. That this violence is ostensibly in response to the creatures' violence enacted against one another makes what happens in the flood all the more remarkable. This story of divine wrath is regularly smoothed over in the modern church with its discomfort over such things. As the story morphs from being one of genocide meant for an adult audience into a trip to the zoo for children, this is unfortunate because rendering the story as one about pairs of animals for whom everything works out tidily, in the end robs the scene of its power to shock the reader further. For the second major feature of this text, in addition to the promise of never again, is the fact that this promise is made to everybody. It is important to remember that this is the religious text of a peculiar group of people, a small, third-rate vassal state subject to the major players in the region, a group of people whose identity was maintained by differentiating themselves from others by every available means. Here in this text, their text, they tell the story of their deity making a covenant with the whole world. Through Lent, I invite you to engage with the various covenants, the promises and relationships, pledges and arrangements and commitments that we are called to live out. With each week's lections, ask yourself the following questions. Who is included? What are the gains? What are the losses? Where is the power? And where is the freedom? The covenant of promise is God's covenant with Noah, and it was sealed with a rainbow, and all are held under the rainbow's arch. May it be so.
Strength.
become so overwrought in hopes that sends a shining ray far down the future's broadening way, in peace that only thou canst give. With thee, O Master, let me live.
Our closing prayer. As a people traveling through life together, sharing the journey of faith through these weeks of Lent, we seek God's presence in our lives. We recall those who have been a part of the covenant with God in the past: Noah and the hope of the rainbow, Abraham and Sarah on their journey to a new land and new beginnings, Moses and the struggle to find freedom out of slavery. Indeed, may we add our own journey at this time for Pilgrim United Church in planning a future almost surely filled with change, but also with hope. Now we hear anew the promise of a new covenant, the promise of new life and wholeness for all. We tend to cling to the past. We are afraid to let go and open ourselves to new possibilities. Help us, gracious God, to embrace your covenant and the promise it holds for one and all. In silence, we confess our personal needs to you, O God. Well, the assurance found in these words are a helpful reminder that God declares, "I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sins no more." Thanks be to God. Amen. May the path that Christ walks to bring justice upon the earth, to bring light to those who sit in shadows, to bring out those who live in servitude, and to bring new things to all creation. May this path run through our lives. May we be the road Christ takes. Go in peace. See you next week.